Good afternoon, everybody. How's it going? This is Philosopossum. Once again, I'm interviewing another YouTuber. Joining me today is the Libertarian Sith. Is that what you prefer to go by?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. Joining me
at
to.
least on YouTube, yeah.
Okay, okay. Everybody, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Libertarian Sith. How's it going?
Hello.
How's the lockdown treating you?
Actually, I've been handling, my schedule hasn't been interfered too much in
Right.
that I was lucky enough to have one of my jobs, the job that I work at, was deemed essential. So
Yeah.
I still got to keep it
My job
during
wasn't.
all this.
Yeah, my job wasn't deemed essential. However, because it's possible to work remotely, I still was able to keep working. Because
Uh,
I work in IT, and that's fairly simple to work with,
okay.
remotely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Surprised they didn't consider that essential, though. But well.
yeah,
Yeah, but I guess that just kind of shows how arbitrary
the
it is.
government is, yeah, because I was kind of mentioning that in some of my videos. My video
Hmm.
with Kyle Klinsky, and I I respond to Larry Hogan's whole speech because I live in Maryland, so our governor is Larry Hogan. So I responded to his
Okay.
speech. I was like, okay, what is essential? What criteria do you use? What's preventing a non-essential business from slipping the government a little bit of money to let them stay? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Yeah. Did you see that
Yeah.
video with?
I don't think I saw that video specifically.
Okay, because I
I
know
haven't seen every single video you've done, but I've seen a few of them.
right. Specifically with regards to COVID-19, I responded to Kyle Klinsky and Larry Hogan's whole
Oh wait, I
speech.
remember that. No wait, is Kyle Kalinske? Is that secular talk?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, I remember the one that you did with secular talk.
yeah, and I responded to Larry Hogan as well. I actually did a video.
Yeah,
I got my camcorder out, just kind of walked around downtown and just kind of showed everybody, hey, this is kind of some of the bullshit that's going on right now.
yeah.
Yeah, I had a free weekend, nothing really better to do, so I figured why not. But
Yeah.
anyways, that's enough banter. Let's get a move on. Now moving forward,
All right.
if you, I guess the way I usually start these out is if you could just kind of a brief introduction. So if you could just kind of briefly explain, like who you are, what you do, what got you
Okay.
involved on YouTube, summarize your political
hmm
views, just
Well,
things like
yeah,
that.
I would be the No, I am the libertarian Sith. If you haven't heard over there, I guess I've been actually wanting to do YouTube for a while, and finally got around to doing it. And I had a lot of different ideas of what my channel would have been like if I did it, and this is just what I finally decided on. And it kind of decided that even doing it with my rather crappy quality, that might as well, if wait for the best, it's never really going to happen. So you might as well keep doing it with the shitty quality that you got.
Right. And the thing is, you don't even need the best equipment in the world to do it. Like when I
Hmm.
first started doing this on YouTube, I splurged on like a $120 Blue Yeti mic, and then
Yeah.
about a month ago, the son of a bitch stopped working. So now I have this, like, right now I'm using like this $20 Logitech headset mic that I got for work, and to my surprise, it was actually better quality. So there you go,
Yeah.
$20 mic, better
Uh
quality
huh.
than a $120 one.
Yeah. And now let's see here. That I would consider myself to be, an ANCAP libertarian and whatnot. I would, I guess, lean quite a bit towards the more Hoppian view of things, though I wouldn't consider myself far of that much. I wouldn't consider myself really a reactionary. I wouldn't even really consider myself to be all that socially conservative, yet alone, reactionary or ultra traditionalist.
Right, because I've heard of Hoppianism before. I don't know all the details of it because I found about it. I found out about it in passing. I explained
Hmm.
because I
And I assume in the circle that you probably heard about it, it wasn't probably anything, particularly flattering or accurate.
right, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what it actually is. I know
Hmm.
a lot of people
Now,
like
I'm probably not the best one, I guess, to ask completely and all of that, but well, I guess there's general uh, several ah, got something in my mouth, but there's several sort of criteria factors of it. I guess one being generally the um, is that generally one aspect of hopping is that well, it's generally following the works of Hans Hermann Hoppe and at least agreeing with most of what he says. One of the things that he's well known for is the fact that he believes that democracy, as we know it, or not just democracy, but also the concept of a republic, is actually a step backwards and a step more towards collectivism and authoritarianism rather than a step forward.
Right, and I would agree with that because people say that
Hmm.
democracy. I, people often say
And he would
democracy
say
is more
that,
free than.
and that Hoppe goes so far as to say that while he doesn't endorse monarchy, that monarchy is actually superior and less destructive than democracy is.
Right, because if you think about it, the issue is I define tyranny as the laws being based on somebody's opinion instead of logic, right? Because
Hmm.
because we
Sure.
libertarians we base our views on property rights, things like that, on non-aggression principle, where
Hmm.
if there's because it's firmly rooted in logic, and that I think
Yeah.
what makes it different from tyranny. Tyranny is any system where you have the laws based on somebody's opinion. Now, people
Yeah.
like to make
And democracy definitely,
yeah,
runs a lot of that. And democracy generally also involves a lot of, appeals to emotion.
yeah,
There's also the fact that because government has been expanded to the people, in a sense, are the governments. I use the word people loosely.
right,
Um, whereas the group is the government, I'd say,
because
is that generally it's much more likely that it's expected to take on many of the responsibilities that is usually falls to the individual,
right.
which is also much more falling into um, not only enslavement and collectivism, but also into, I guess you would say, moral decay, or that big D word, degeneracy,
Right, because
that gets thrown around a lot.
right. Well, my big thing is that somehow people imagine that there's a difference between if the laws are based on one person's opinion, that's tyranny. If the laws are based
Hmm.
on multiple people's opinions, suddenly it becomes not tyranny. It's like now adding the number of people in charge doesn't make it less arbitrary, right? Like
Yeah.
if and
Hmm.
practically speaking, from a practical functional standpoint, what exactly is the difference between my freedoms being at the mercy of one person's opinion or my freedoms being at the mercy of 51% of the population?
Hmm.
And that's
And
really
also a thing that Hop also states is that also on how monarchy being relatively superior is that the monarch um, generally just gets his position by right of birth, so that's no real factor in what kind of person he is. Whereas in a democracy, the person specifically has to essentially be a con man in order to get into office,
right,
making a lot of promises he doesn't intend to keep and whatnot.
right, exactly. Like not that like you'd almost
Hmm.
prefer a dictatorship to a democracy because it's like how much if only one person is wielding the power, how much damage can one person
Hmm.
do? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that is also a point that he goes over in that it's generally easier for if you have a bad monarch or ruler, it's generally easier to deal with him and whatnot, as opposed to a democracy where it's an entire group of bad people.
Right, right. Because
And so you get rid of one head, so what? You only got rid of one out of 10 bad people.
right, because I know I recently, just yesterday actually, I was doing a debate with Anton Deibel, who goes by Skeptical Human on YouTube.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if you've seen him or not.
I have not actually.
Okay, yeah, but I responded to one of his videos where he talks about the income tax.
Hmm.
He refutes the idea that taxation is theft, and he goes on this 45-minute video like, here's why taxation is a good thing. I made a response video to that, which is like an hour and a half. So if you have an hour and a, yeah, yeah. So if you haven't,
Yeah, I
if you
might check that out. I've checked out long videos before, but
exactly,
having to do it in increments, not all
it
at
was a pain
once.
in the ass, but I didn't want to leave that
Hmm.
any stone
Yeah.
unturned. With the
Another, I guess, aspect, of course, of Hoppe is, his social conservatism.
right,
Though many of his followers are much more socially conservative than he himself was,
right,
since he wasn't like ultra traditional and all of that.
huh,
Um, but even myself, I wouldn't consider myself super socially conservative, but I would say that that general traditions are very beneficial in many ways.
Right.
I guess would be the best thing
Right here. So going
to
back.
it. But unlike most of them, I wouldn't say that I expect everyone to be traditional and all of that. In fact, I think it's much better is if, unlike most, I would actually probably be more of a unique case in that I would believe that tradition and non-traditionism can coexist with each other, and that's kind of the more, a bit more of the
Yeah,
hot
same
take of
here. Like,
the
there's no, like,
over there.
it's not necessarily a trade-off. You can have tradition to an
Yeah.
extent, new things to an extent. Yeah,
Hmm.
I hear what you're saying
And
there.
I would believe that if you were to completely eliminate the government, most people would choose. Again, people generally view that uh, most people would naturally choose tradition. So the ones that don't aren't really in favor because that's just the exception and all of that. Like for example, people born blind aren't suddenly an, aren't aren't suddenly a threat to the sighted people or whatnot.
Right, and
Probably a bad analogy, but
right, I kind of get what you're saying, but it's like the idea that any other thing. I think I pointed this out in one of your videos. It's like if it has to be forced, is it really a tradition? Like,
hmm yeah.
if a tradition is something
I would,
cultural that people just
yeah,
kind
I
of
would try
naturally
and
go,
do some sort of a follow up to that and to try and cover more
right,
bases. But
right,
yeah, I need to get into making longer videos and
right.
to more of a dedicated script.
Right. So before I mentioned I did a debate with Skeptical Human, which will probably be uploaded tomorrow, sometime tomorrow. But one of the points he talks about is he and a lot of other people. He's a hardcore leftist progressive, and they tend to make appeals to
Mhm.
society and we as a collective, and
Oh,
that
yeah,
tend
that actually gets into something earlier I was going to say, but yeah,
right. Yeah.
doing things like collective needs and greater good.
And I point this out in the debate, like there's this illogic of one person like I can't go to my neighbor's house and force him to pay for my health care. Two people can't. Three people can't. It's like it's like the Sarit's paradox. Like how many at what point how many individuals do you have to add before it goes from mob rule to democracy or the collective or whatever.
Well, let me see here. Well, obviously, logically, even if it's 100% of the population, that still isn't, that doesn't really make it justified. After all, the vast majority of the population supported Adolf Hitler's ethnic cleansing.
Right. Yeah, and
Just
it's
because it's the will of the people doesn't make it moral or right. If
yeah,
it did, then that basically just means that might makes right.
and then I asked him again in another one of our debates. I asked him, okay, are gangbangs rape? Because what he says was, well, you may not consent to taxation, but we as a society have agreed to be taxed. And then it was like, okay, are gangbangs rape? If consent of the group or consent of the collective overrides consent of the individual, then one of the implications of that is,
Hmm.
I guess, gangbangs aren't rape. You
Yeah.
know, and it's just like that. It sounds nice when people say the greater good, or we as a society, or we as a collective. It sounds good,
Hmm.
but it just falls apart
That
under
goes
even the
into the
most
social
basic.
contract sort of
Yeah, the
thing there.
social contract. We as a society, we as a collective. Sam Cedar and Paula Dice use this language, and it's like, it's stuff that sounds good and sounds rational, but when it falls apart, like under the slightest bit of
Hmm.
scrutiny, it just crumples, even under those basic logical scrutiny. And I was appealed
Yeah.
to Immanuel Kant. I think he was one of the first people to kind of create a
Oh,
moral
Immanuel
theory.
Kant, the person that that objectivists hate, who's basically the person they view as the Antichrist, basically,
I don't understand
if
that
they were to believe
because
in such things like that. Well, this is, I think, my understanding of Immanuel Kant's philosophy is very minor, and to be honest, it generally comes from people that don't really have a very high opinion of him. Again, the objectivists.
right,
But at least from what I understand from there, which obviously is a bad, source, but is that Immanuel Kant's entire philosophy is basically based around abstinence. He views um, abstinence and sacrifice as a virtue, and basically almost a philosophy of borderline masochism. Basically, again, this is coming from a very
right.
biased source,
Yeah, I would
from what I
imagine
hear
that
this
would
from.
be very
So,
biased because I've studied Kant. I took philosophy in college, like I my degree
Hmm.
is computer science, but of course I took it as an elective, and I studied philosophy in my spare time. And Kant was one of the biggest philosophers I've studied, and he's a very masochist. He's very the categorical imperative outright says that treat it's basically a fancy philosophical way of saying treat others as you'd like to be treated. And the fact
Hmm.
that objectivists tend to criticize him kind of strikes
Well,
me
they
as
criticize them generally because, like for example, I think that one objectivist mentioned that Kant viewed good art as one that the artist takes the least amount of pleasure in making.
right. Okay, yeah, I'm not entirely familiar with his aesthetics. I mostly focus on his ethical
Yeah.
views because
Hmm.
he was one of the
Well, I'm
first.
not saying that. Yeah, again, this is coming from a bad source, but it isn't
Right,
so much that he encourages, sadism, but again, it focuses on abstinence and stoicism to the point of it being basically borderline masochism,
right.
to where you're so um, devoted to other people and so humble that you basically are in a state of borderline self-loathing.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never heard that part of him, but again, it seems like the source
Yeah,
you're
that's
using is
again.
biased.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll admit that this is kind of biased, and who knows, maybe some objectivists might show a lot and tell me how I might even be misrepresenting on how they view him and all of
right,
that.
right. But the main thing is that Kant was one of the first philosophers who ever put create a moral theory to put an emphasis on the individual, like the dignity that you have by
Which is
virtue.
kind of interesting, is that a lot of people have mentioned Kant being anti-individual in his philosophies, although I guess not as badly as
Far
someone
from
like
it. Like
Thomas
his, he
Hobbes.
outright says it's wrong to use people. These days, like if you're like a
Co-
witness to a crime or
Although
something,
actually, objectivists would also be of the opinion that it's wrong to use people too,
it's wrong. Yeah,
ironically.
like a lot of stuff the government does now. Like they say,
Mhm. Since they actually view that Kant, basically his philosophy was kind of basically re, was basically the renaissance of authoritarianism and statism, basically. That it was basically first laid out by Plato, and then it kind of fell out of the wayside with the Enlightenment, because they generally viewing that very positively. And
right,
then um, and then Kant shows up a lot and kind of gives authoritarianism and statism a sort of renaissance, basically with his philosophy, and that it was basically laid the foundwork for Marxism um, and fascism. At least that's like how Kirk Wilcox, I guess mentioned it on his own sort of a video. Though Kirk Wilcox also seems to also in his video indirectly attribute Friedrich Nietzsche as well to a revive of authoritarianism and statism. And while Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't exactly a fan of freedom in all of that, since many of his heroes were authoritarians and statists like Napoleon Bonaparte and Cesare Borgia. But he didn't romanticize them because they were authoritarian. He romanticized them um, just because they were badass. He thought they were badasses, basically, who just did what they wanted to do,
right,
even if
yeah,
it came at other people's expense. It was basically freedom to the. Basically, almost his view was a kind of a straw man of freedom, to where it doesn't include other people's freedom. The
yeah,
freedom to enslave other people, basically.
yeah. Nietzsche was very like he didn't accept ethics. He thought ethics as a concept was
No,
BS.
actually, that's Marx Stirner. Nietzsche actually did have a view of ethics, but his view of ethics was basically borderline alien to everybody else's,
Right,
because he basically viewed his ethics was based around evolution slash change and stagnation and destruction. He viewed evolution as good, as morally good, and stagnation as morally bad, as well
uh,
as destruction as morally bad. So he
right,
basically believed that society should be in a constant state of evolution, and that diverging from that is um is morally bad.
right.
So he did have a sense of right and wrong. It was just not based in any of the same things
Different
that
from
most
the
people's sense
status
of it.
quo, yeah. Because
Hmm.
there's
Yeah,
deontology, there's utilitarianism, and anything that doesn't really fall into those general categories is usually considered fringe. Uh,
yeah.
but
Hmm.
because that's kind of the base of basic,
hmm
kind of common
And so he would
sense.
have probably viewed Nazism as being, morally bad by his own standards, since it would have just been a view of stagnation and whatnot, as well as since generally believed, that the individual ought to rebel against the standards of society,
Yeah,
and Nazism kind of, is all about reinforcing those.
yeah. It's funny because people often accuse Nietzsche of contributing to the Holocaust or giving Hitler his ideas, and it's like not really.
I mean, he got his ideas as much from Nietzsche as he got from Charles Darwin or from the Catholic Church
Yeah, like
or from the pagan gods, since he did like paganism quite a bit. So, I mean, there's plenty of different places he drew inspiration from.
yeah, exactly. Like he straight up copied Napoleon's military style. Like like
I mean, Napoleon wasn't a good person to himself, though. To be fair,
yeah. It's actually I'm
Mhm.
surprised
And
that
Napoleon was actually the one who created the modern nation military as we know it,
yeah,
to where armies became so large that life became cheap, to where you
yeah.
could just throw away soldiers again and again and again and again and again.
That's interesting. Yeah, especially considering it always makes me laugh. Like Hitler studied Napoleon and still thought it was a good idea to invade Russia, to try and invade Russia.
Although it was well, in Napoleon's case, it was bad because he was actually his main force was actually in Spain, and Russia pissed him off, and he was such an egotist narcissist that he couldn't let his ego, couldn't swallow his pride, so he had to attack them while trying to invade Spain. Oh, actually, no, it was somehow. It was actually, I think, Portugal he was trying to invade, but he was crossing through Spain and decided to rape and pillage them anyway.
Right. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Yeah. Because if
hmm
you think about Russia, like the geography alone, before you even meet their army, like the geography alone would kick your ass. It's miles and
hmm
miles of
Although
mountains, cold
actually,
temperatures,
in
water.
Hitler's case, he was actually winning most of the Russian war at first.
Right.
It was eventually the Soviets got their act together and actually um, decided to actually, do some more competent things, military tactics, as well as I think that Stalin deciding to let his generals just kind of do their own thing, since before he was micromanaging things a lot.
Right. So, anyways,
Mhm.
uh,
And also the fact that America got involved, and then that kind of then he had to divide his attention up.
yeah, because that's the thing. Before it was like Hitler could focus on the East Front, and
And
now
actually,
America
defeating
gets
Russia was
involved.
actually Hitler's goal the entire time was to conquer Russia.
Yeah, all of a sudden
He
America.
only conquered the rest. He only invaded the rest of Europe just because he was worried about them getting in his way.
Right, so he could focus on the
Yeah.
East Front, and then the ironic thing
Heck,
is that
he. The ironic thing is that he probably could have just ignored the rest of Europe and just teamed up with them against Russia, and he would have been hailed a hero.
because yeah, what were they gonna do? Yeah, exactly. But
No, everybody hated Russia at the time.
yeah,
It was only whenever they had a common enemy with Russia that anyone actually got along with them.
exactly. So
And
it's
this wasn't just because Russia was communist. People had hated Russia for years and were terrified of them, even under the Tsar, to where Russia was kind of never actually considered part of Europe almost.
it
And that really hasn't really changed very much with the way Russia's currently doing, but
it's weird.
I won't
They're
get too much
like
far into that.
yeah, they're culturally they span Europe and Russia spans Europe and Asia. So it's this interesting cultural mix of Europe and Asia. It's because I'm
hmm With a bit of Arabic mixed in there, despite not actually being Arabic.
yeah, because here's the thing. I'm Slavic. My
Oh,
ancestry
okay.
is largely Polish, Russian, Ukrainian. So I know a
hmm
lot about like the cultural and ethnic influences there. But anyways, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to kind of shift gears here.
Yeah, we're getting off topic. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff to discuss, but kind of veering
Yeah.
off.
I guess let me see here. Another, I guess, aspect of Hoppianism is that generally talked about quite a bit, both positive and negative, is Hoppe's view of covenant communities, which generally the idea is that they are communities where they have mutually agreed upon rules that everybody follows and whatnot. That would function kind of like a neighborhood's homeowners association almost.
Okay, yeah, because here's the thing. Like I said, I'm not really an expert in Hobbesianism. I haven't looked much into it. I know some of the basics,
Hmm.
and in all fairness, I may have misinformed. I may have a malinformed idea of it because I've heard more criticisms of it than support for it. But
Hmm.
uh, I think I've heard esoteric entities say this before. Like,
Yes, and like I said, coming across as a
yeah,
source of information that is neither flattering nor accurate.
yes, kind of like the objectivist with Kant. But anyways, I think esoteric entity. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think I remember him saying something to the effect of Hoppians are kind of like statists in denial. Like they want what they're advocating for. These covenant communities are basically states, but they just don't want to call them that. What would
I mean, if you want to consider if you want to consider a homeowners association of states, or if you just want to consider a society in which people agree upon rules for everyone to follow a state, in which case you're basically kind of catering to this stereotype of anarchy meaning no rules.
right? Because I feel like this is one of the reasons, and I sort of mentioned this in my video.
Well, there's actually also another aspect as to why it isn't a state, not just because of that, in that with a state, whenever somebody is at a state as, well, they define it as a monopoly on arbitration, which is kind of a bit vague
I don't
as to
feel that's
whether
entirely accurate
that's
myself.
that's not exactly an accurate term, because even under the United States as it exists, the United States technically isn't the sole arbiter within the United States. There are other independent arbiters that handle petty differences between the two, so it's technically not a monopoly on arbitration.
Right,
What it is a monopoly on final decision making
right.
or ultimate decision making,
That's
in
sort
that
of
it will that it is able to override the decisions made by any independent arbiters.
that's sort of how I define the that's how I define a
Mhm.
state myself because I'm a little bit I'm a little bit of a statist a little bit. I'll explain the details later, but basically
Yeah, I think it kind of.
I define
I think I've kind of, oh, well, anyway, I'll let you talk about that later. Anyway, the reason is that with the state, generally, anybody it is the one that has the final say in anything, including disputes people have with the state itself. That if somebody has a problem with the state puts itself on trial, it gives itself a lawyer, and then at the end of the day, it's the one judging itself on that and giving itself the quote quote punishments.
right. I would
With
define okay.
a covenant community is not actually an arbiter, or is that when someone has a grievance with the covenant community, it is judged by an independent third party, and it's the one that decides who is, innocent or guilty.
Right, because I've heard before when people say the state has a monopoly in arbitration, I feel that's inaccurate because it kind of implies that anytime there's a disagreement whatsoever, it has to go through the state, and like it's like you
Yeah,
can't.
I think that some of these people actually probably do think something like that. I wouldn't be surprised.
And I've pointed this
Though
out.
I guess I don't want to assume too much.
Right, yeah, and I've pointed this out before. I think it would be more accurate to say the state has finality on arbitration. Like,
Mhm.
if like you don't have to go through the state to arbitrate, but suppose you try other methods of arbitration and they end up not being able to resolve the issue, it all ultimately goes to the state. So I
Well,
think that's a
again,
better
it's
way of
I
thinking
guess
about it.
of final decision making because the state can overrule the decisions made by any independent arbiter.
Right,
Since if two people go to an independent court and it rules something else, the state can just go in there and say, that actually that breaks our rules or something like that, and so your decision is overruled, and we have the final say in what actually goes on here.
right. I think that's a bit more accurate way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Now,
Mhm.
I've I floated the
Mhm.
idea around of panarchism before
Yeah.
with other groups. The idea that
I mean, in a way, Hobbesianism does generally view quite a bit more like, I guess, panarchy. I would consider myself a panarchist as well. Generally, think is that I don't think everybody wants the same sort of community, and that they'll have different ways of doing it and whatnot.
Right.
So you'll generally have like the community, which would be like ultra traditional Christian and whatnots, and generally the rules over there of everybody having to be followed by that. And then you'll have probably some other more you'll have ones that probably would still be Christian, but they'd be more, for lack of a better word, liberal.
Right.
And then you'd have more secular ones. And here's the thing: is that more strict communities, I mean, logically, will be a lot smaller, while the bigger communities would have a lot more laxity and rules and whatnot.
Right.
Since
Because
a lot of people probably wouldn't want to live under a very strict sort of thing.
right. Because I kind of floated the idea of panarchism around in
Hmm.
certain like on certain Discord servers. I said what I basically believe is that multiple governments should exist, and you should be allowed to pick which one to live under. Or if you're an anarchist, you can pick none of them and just live outside of them, and then
Hmm.
everybody's happy. And then the response I got was that, oh, you're basically a Hoppian. And
Yeah.
that was my first sort of introduction to that concept, because I before then I
Hmm.
had no idea what a Hoppian was.
It is quite a bit. The idea of a covenant community is quite a bit like panarchy and all that. And I even imagine that under it, not even though Hop himself was strictly capitalist, that not every sort of covenant, every sort of community and like that would even wind up having a capitalist market. There would probably be some mutualist or syndicalist or even um, voluntary quote unquote communist.
Yeah,
It depends
so
on how you would define communist. Probably in the way communists would define
like
themselves,
voluntary.
rather than how non-communists would define them.
Yeah, because I heard there's like anarcho-communism, people who are like, yeah,
Yeah.
we want to kind of set up our own little commune type system. We want to
Hmm.
leave everyone else alone, but this is kind of what we would do. And I'm like, great, as long
Yeah.
as you're not hurting anyone, knock yourself out. But
Hmm.
one of the issues that comes up there is like, how do you define the state, which is sort of what we were getting into. And
Yeah.
I just kind of think uh,
Hmm.
if you've
And
watched.
while I would certainly prefer capitalist myself, I would say that I also would have it would have in more recently developed quite a bit of sympathy for both mutualism and syndicalism as well. Which I guess syndicalism is different from communism in that syndicalism isn't necessarily anti-market, though it is still anti-hierarchy. It's even anti-hierarchy is to a less extent, in that the idea is that everything is based around unions and whatnot, and they'll organize sort of society. And within the unions, there'd be various different hierarchies within the unions, I assume. So it's not necessarily anti-hierarchy; it's just believing that the way for a legitimate hierarchy is through, direct democracy. I mean, that's kind of a bit cringe, but
Right, because I know a lot of
So I guess
people.
out of all the various socialist modes of of societies, I guess syndicalist would probably be the one I would probably have the most sympathy for.
Right, because I know if you've heard of like Thought Slime, he'll often say that, oh, anarcho-capitalists want hierarchies, so I guess they're not real anarchists. And it's like, no,
Hmm.
anarchists aren't against
Well, yeah.
hierarchies; they're
Even
against
the thing
government.
is, though, even whenever in his video over there, he defined it as being against unjust hierarchies. But then later on, he just simply doesn't go. He doesn't go into what is an unjust hierarchy and what is a just hierarchy, and the rest of his video kind of just assumes that just because it's a hierarchy, therefore it's an unjust one.
Well, even recently,
That's not even how it goes. Heck, even non-compete did acknowledge that there's a difference between a justified hierarchy and an unjustified hierarchy.
right, because I
So that
recently,
makes
yeah,
even even non-compete slightly smarter than Thought Slime,
right,
if
yeah,
only by a little bit.
exactly. He's slightly less cringe, but yeah, I
Mm.
recently responded to a video by a guy named Why I Hate the World. Uh,
Oh yeah.
yeah, he actually responded to me recently, which is kind of funny. But
Yeah, I didn't see his response though.
right, and he makes the same mistake. He says, "Well, he makes this as a supposed point against anarchism that oh humans naturally form hierarchies." I'm like, okay, but anarchists aren't against all hierarchies; they're against government. Yes,
Hmm.
saying someone's against a particular instance of blank isn't the same thing as being against blank. Like
Which is probably, I guess, what people would also do
yeah,
there.
I use this example. I use the example in my video
Hmm.
because someone
Since again,
doesn't
I
like.
would identify as being a right wing, which is something that actually for quite a bit of whiles, within the various libertarian community has gotten quite a bit of scrutiny from these particular individuals that, kind of want to avoid directly mentioning myself, but the earlier people that you were talking about there.
Right.
Well, generally, it's on the ground, not only the grounds of generally, since the more stereotypical one is, laissez-faire capitalism being right wing, but also generally right wing is the acknowledgments that certain hierarchies are natural, inevitable, and or beneficial.
Yeah, but
Which I would say to that with the business well, with generally that this is also, I guess, another aspect of. I don't know if this is necessarily an aspect specifically. I think though that it is a aspect of Hoppe, though it wasn't something I heard him talk that much about. But generally, there's the aspect there that of the rejection of egalitarianism, specifically the um, equality of outcome, and to a lesser extent, I suppose. Well, I don't want to get too,
right.
there's the general premise is that people are not equal to each other. That some people are stronger, some people are smarter, some people are faster, and whatnot.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. But yeah,
hmm
saying that.
I'm trying to avoid too many, hot button topics, with on the site.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. It's hard. It's hard to gauge how
hmm
people react to shit these days. So I hear you. But
Yeah,
uh,
but anyway, what was I going at? So because of that, people will naturally sort into hierarchies,
exactly. Like I kind of
and
said.
that it would be inevitable there,
Yeah.
as well as viewing that certain hierarchies would be more beneficial, that a traditional business model is more effective than a quote unquote horizontal worker co-op. In a way, the sort of syndicalist union thing would be a step up from the workers co-op, since there's technically within the union various different levels of hierarchy and whatnot. It's just generally within a union the hierarchies are decided through democracy, and
Right.
that people vote on the union leaders and the union the more union higher uppers and whatnot.
Well, that's an example of democracy that's fine because it's like you're not being
hmm
forced to participate. Here's the thing about voting. Like a lot of anarchists are super
Well,
anti-voting.
yeah, I guess, yeah, since it's different from that is a different form of democracy, I guess.
Exactly.
Well, it is even, I guess, necessarily democracy. You could say that Hoppe is so much against would be more the republic model in general. I guess you could say that he's more against, which is the general idea of we are the government and all that. The people are the government,
Right. Yeah. I think
or that the group is the
there's
government.
a video by Larkin Rose that like
hmm
makes fun of the whole idea of we are the government. It's really funny. It's like really you
And
can.
with unions and all that, not every single person is a member of the union that's running, the business or whatnot. I would imagine it wouldn't.
Right. Yeah. Unions are an interesting subject that you could really spend a lot of time on because
Mhm.
I'm
And
very
and despite how it is most, self-proclaimed capitalists and right-wingers aren't against unions, they're just against unions as they exist on the state because they are often involuntary.
yeah
People are often forced into joining and, signing up with them.
yeah. Paula Dice made
And
a
whenever the
video.
union goes on, and when the union goes on strike, everybody is involuntarily forced to go on strike with the union.
Yeah, recently, actually, it's not recently, but Paula Dice made a video where he basically argues in favor of compulsory union membership, and I plan to when I get a chance, I'm going to go debunk
hmm
that because it's like that's ruining that makes unions shitty, like that's bad.
Yeah. hmm That unions are effective means are I would say on themselves are a good thing. It's just so long as they're voluntary.
Yeah, because a lot of
Especially whenever they become involuntary, not only are they now involuntary, they also generally become super corrupt.
right, because kind of the whole point of a union is that it's a voluntary alternative to say like labor laws and stuff like that. So making them
Yeah.
involuntary kind of defeats that point of it.
And they generally wind up essentially be generally strangle holding on various different businesses and whatnot, as well as colluding with the local governments.
Right, and then what happens
Kind of
is
kind of funny that people view businesses as capitalists, and when businesses and governments collude, that is capitalist, but view unions as somehow socialist. But would that mean that when unions and government collude, that is socialist? Should we just start calling that sort of when governments do things on unions' behalf or vice versa? That's basically crony socialism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like when the government it's only capitalism when the government does stuff they don't like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, because a lot of times people will say, like, when they advocate for labor laws, they'll say that we need government to protect workers because unions aren't good enough. And seldom do they acknowledge that
Hmm.
a big part of the reason unions aren't good enough is because government. Basically, what
Yeah.
happens is government handcuffs unions to a pole, steps along and says, "Oh, looks like he can't help you anymore, but don't worry, I can do it." You know.
Yeah. Hmm.
And
Um. That yeah, that unions have largely become the very quote unquote bourgeoisie that they were supposed to fight. Let me see here. I guess it's also another thing that I kind of should mention that's quite a bit of controversy with Hoppa that someone's probably going to point out at some point. Is that there's this one is the idea of physical removal and whatnot. It's something that he gets quite a bit of controversy for. What Hoppe meant by that was social ostracization, and it just so happens that in German, I think the German uh, word for that is like the same word as removal or something like that. And
right,
so there was a translation error, and people just kind of stuck with it.
yeah,
Um,
that's
Now there's some people. Now I guess so there is some aspects um where there are probably some Hoppians that do want, people to actually be, removed from the property and whatnot. But I guess here's the sort of thing, though, is that whenever someone buys a property within a covenant community, they would be consenting to all of the rules that are in there, and that would probably be even the rule of if you break these rules, we can kick you out. That is 100% what happens whenever you join a purchase property within a well, not necessarily kicking you out, but that is what happens whenever you join a neighborhood association. Well, not when you join the neighborhood association. When you purchase property in a neighborhood that has a neighborhood association, you generally by you generally have to sign some sort of agreement that the neighborhood association can uh, punish you if you break the rules that the neighborhood association has set out.
right. You have to
Now,
sign that
that's
as a
usually
condition
just
of
fining you, though. But
right. Like they can't like people
and I
compare.
assume that most covenant communities may not be that strict. Some will be more strict than others. There will be some that will almost certainly, kick you out if you break the rules. Others would just probably fine you, and others would just, encourage social ostracization. But there's also another thing is that when you're on uh, somebody else's, when you're on a business store's property and whatnot, and you break the rules of the business and all that, they still have the right to kick you and remove you from their property, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Hmm. And there's also a general line that Hoppe draws quite a bit of contention from, where I guess that he mentions in his book, The God, no, Democracy, the God That Failed, in which he says that in a covenant community designed for the preservation of family and tradition, that communists, advocates of democracy and egalitarianism, and moral hedonists ought to be physically removed from the community. That is the quote that generally drives him as much ire as he, said. But there's, I guess, some things noticed about that quote is that he started with it being in a community meant to uphold and protect family and tradition and whatnot. Oh, and also the line I forgot to mention is that he also in that list added in advocates of homosexuality, which also is generally stereotyped as him being rather homophobic. Is that generally he said the advocates of it, basically those who are trying to wanting other is wanting other people to be gay and whatnot, that
Right.
they to be removed, and specifically in a community based around family. So
Right. I think that's probably like I kind of made this point before that I'm not sure if it was someone named Robert Nozick.
hmm and Hoppe himself also pointed out that people would also make covenant communities that would be more countercultured and whatnot, and would probably um you know remove anybody who was homophobic in them.
Right. So, if you've heard someone named Robert Nozick, because he kind of has some opinions that are relevant on this, it sort of goes back to the idea of where do you. One of the big criticisms of anarcho-capitalism is sort of where do you draw the line between business and government, and it kind of goes back to the Sorites paradox. Like, if I have
hmm
a business, right, how close to government does that business can that business get before it's a government? And that's sort of the main criticisms of anarcho-capitalism, and sort of what Nozick argues in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, because he was a minarchist, and he basically argued
hmm
that under anarcho-capitalism you'll have business that can basically provide these certain types of products and services that are unique, like what are they called? Natural monopolies, public goods, things that are kind of
hmm
difficult to compete with or exclude non-payers. You'd have a particular business that just so happens to be good at doing that, kind of monopolize, kind of get an edge on that over an area, and it'll sort of be in effect a state, even if you don't call it that. And that's kind of what Nozick argued, that anarcho-capitalists would end up with a government. They may not call it that. That's kind of what they'd get. Was basically what he argued.
hmm
And I kind of have similar views in terms of like what, um, and that's why I personally, and I was kind of hinting at this earlier, I don't strictly identify as an anarchist or a minarchist, because I feel the distinction comes down to different conceptions of what a state is. I mostly
hmm
identify, like I call myself a libertarian and a voluntarist. I say what I
hmm
just say plain and simple. If we respect individual rights, if everything's voluntary, I don't. It doesn't matter what your organization is called, and that's sort of the opinion I take, and I think that kind of strikes more at the core of what's important, because when people argue like, oh, can a libertarianism have a government, or can you, or can someone,
Yeah, yeah.
and yeah, I feel that that's kind of a more productive viewpoint to
hmm
take, because
hmm
I think Shane Killian makes
Yeah.
a similar argument. He's like, if there,
Yeah, that
if
actually, well, I'll get into, that a bit later, though,
right,
mentioning that, let me see here, where was I? Well, I guess one thing that kind of, I think, mentioned, let me see if I'll mention anything else about Hoppa later on. I can't necessarily think too much about it. I do know that Hoppa also has something known as argumentation ethics, though I coincidentally, I'm not, too sure about all the details of it. If I'm not mistaken, it's the generally a different way of going about first principles, though, in that usually within first principles, the libertarian would argue, would first state up that there can be generally starts out the rules of logic and all of that, and then gets to uses that to prove self ownership. Whereas with Hoppe, generally, you generally start out as in you are the sole user of your body, and therefore you would own yourself. Generally, starting out with self ownership and then working from there, and not having to lay down a foundation over there. I'm not too sure if that's argumentation ethics or if it's something else. I might have to look a bit too much, not too much, but look a bit more into that. I know that there's somebody else, who could, more tell you more about what argumentation ethics is.
yeah, I'll have to look
And
that
I
up.
guess also one of his more controversial takes is generally also the fact that he believes that low time preference being greatly superior to high time preference, and that high time preference generally being bad.
Right, yeah, I can see that.
I mean, I'm kind of. I think, are you still
Yeah,
there?
I'm still here. Yeah.
All right. Did you hear anything in the background?
There's a little bit of things moving around, but I didn't hear too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's definitely because I know there's something called epistemological ethics, or like the ethics of like how to what to believe. I don't know if it's related or not, uh, but yeah, it's, interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Where was But yeah, I think probably the
Yeah.
biggest difference between panarchists, because it sounds like panarchism and Hoppianism is basically two sides of the same coin. They kind of disagree on
Mm-hmm.
what would
Yeah.
this be considered a government. I think is probably the key difference there.
Yeah, and also I guess there's generally with Hoppians also being a lot, less kind to, communists and whatnot.
Right, right. Because I also made this. I'm just curious what your opinion is on this. The analogy, sort of what I see the differences between anarchism and statism, at least with regards to panarchy. So I usually compare statism to renting and anarchism to owning. So when you rent, you give up the freedom of land ownership. Like when you rent a
Hmm.
property, right? You kind
It's
of
kind of a bad implication there, though,
yeah, like you sign
that
a
the government owns everything.
right. Well, it's sort of it's an analogy. It's an analogy. It's not quite 100% analogous, but sort of the same idea. Like I'm voluntarily deciding when you move into an apartment building, you sign a lease that says I agree to these rules and I agree to pay this much in
Hmm.
rent and I get to
Yeah.
live here. Where and I get to have certain responsibilities handled for me if we're about maintenance or anything like that. Whereas if you own your property, you don't have to pay anybody. You don't have to follow anybody's rules. It's yours. But anything as far as like
Hmm.
maintenance goes, you have to handle that. And I draw a similar
Yeah.
conclusion for the difference between like choosing to live in a state or choosing to live in anarchy. When you choose to live in a state, it's like you agree to follow these laws, pay these taxes, but in return, you
Hmm.
have certain
Well,
responsibilities
and I
handled
guess
for you.
here's also something that also generally would also separate me from, well, not separate me from other hop. I don't know if other Hoppians would come to this, would see it this way or not, but it would certainly separate me from, I guess, generally from the other group of, people mentioning before, is that if you would have a state, a society where there, an anarchist society and all that, and so long as other governments allow people to freely leave their, territories and whatnot, then they've generally, then they have actually just become, now have become voluntary governments essentially. The people who are still in them are there voluntarily now because they can leave if they want and actually have a place to go. The reason that doesn't work now is because there isn't, another place to go right now.
Right, because people use
Whenever there actually is another place to go, then that argument now becomes valid, and generally the social contract now
mm,
actually means something.
well, I mean, really, if you really technically speaking, uh, there's no territory like in Antarctica or like
Hmm.
there's no
Well, there isn't a settlement, I guess, and with there being an anarchist, settlement or
right.
community.
Like it's kind of like there's no there. Strictly speaking, there is unclaimed territory out there where anarchists can go to live government free, but it's seldomly it's very few places.
Hmm.
Let's be honest. If the government hasn't stuck its flag there, it's probably not the kind of place you'd want to live.
Yeah.
You're probably talking either a place that's super cold like Antarctica or some random island somewhere with like nothing on it. So strictly speaking, anarchists can't. There are places for them to go where they can live government free. But or another thing you'd probably
Hmm.
do is, and again, I'm not a lawyer or like an expert in this type of thing, but you buy a boat, sail out to the middle of the Atlantic, because according to the UN, every country only owns 12 miles off its coast. So if you had a big enough boat, you could just
Hmm.
sail out to the middle of the ocean and just be
Yeah.
like, "Fuck it, I'm free." How
I
how?
do know that some
Yeah,
people have tried that and eventually ran into trouble.
I know. I think Esoteric Entity did a video about it. It's called like seasteading, like the idea of building artificial islands, because the technology to create islands exists. They do that in Dubai. They dredge up sand from the ocean floor and then concentrate it in one space and just build artificial islands.
Mm.
And there's a good chance that when that technique can be used to create, because that's something I've always kind of thought about doing, to start my own country, to because there's all the land in the world, all the viable land is basically claimed. So if you want to start your own country these days, you kind of gotta dredge it up and make it basically.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Although I guess there's also, I guess, one thing that would set me apart from most Hoppians would also be the fact that I would identify as being a egoist as well, or at least more of the ethical egoist kind.
Huh, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So what's the distinction?
Um, mhm. Well, generally, the idea of egoism is that every individual follows their own self-interest, and whatnot, and no one being expected to sacrifice for somebody else without receiving anything.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
Hmm. I guess generally view would be, I guess generally view that I would agree with Ayn Rand on most things except for the anti-theism and state-enforced individualism.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of, because people often cite, people who criticize libertarianism often boil it down to Ayn Rand. There's actually a lot of stuff that Ayn Rand says that I disagree with. Like I think, like I'm not a huge fan of the idea that like, like charity is bad, or that.
Well, she didn't actually even say that though.
Yeah, that's a common straw
She
man.
wasn't actually even against charity.
Right.
Mm. She was against somebody, you know, sacrificing everything they have and gaining nothing from it. But generally, she didn't have any. Even somebody actually asked her that she'd have nothing wrong with you giving to the poor and all that, as long as you didn't have that as your main focus and whatnot.
Right, because it's like there's nothing mutually exclusive about, because people often will this is a common talking point you hear
Hmm.
on the left, like socialists, the Bernie Sanders crowd. They often say, well, companies don't care about the public good or helping people, they just care about their profits. As if that's somehow mutually exclusive, as if there's no possible way, as if earning a profit necessarily entails not doing anything to help the poor or the public good, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, and generally speaking, viewing that that it is in people's own self-interest to, cooperate and work together. That mutual aid being, within people's own self-interest.
Yeah,
The funny
exactly.
thing is that actually is something coming from the more individualists on the left. Usually say that against, the market system and whatnot. So.
Right, and a little the irony there is that that actually is an argument in favor of the market system. If people are naturally good, or naturally,
Hmm.
or whatever language they use specifically, but basically the idea is that okay, great, people will give to charity of their own volition, that we don't need welfare or social security or whatever.
Hmm.
It's great when people have these arguments to just kind of shoot their own bullshit in the foot.
Hmm.
Let's see, we're coming up on an hour. We can keep going. We can
Yeah, I don't know if there's something else too.
Yeah, if there's anything else you wanted to talk about or mention real quick, you can go right ahead.
Um, Let me see here if there's something else I can think of. Um, there isn't anything that comes to mind right now. Oh, there is one thing. I guess my general political journey and whatnot
Oh yeah,
is
yeah.
that
Go ahead and just kind of lay that out.
I actually started out as a neocon whenever I was like growing up, and pretty much for almost my entire adolescence was that until eventually I realized that because I was also like, generally what you'd expect, the stereotypical fan of PragerU or Ben Shapiro to be, and generally believing in similar talking points and all of that. Big, expansive, army that would act as the world policemen and generally,
Right.
um, um, but eventually, hmm?
Hello.
All right, where was I? Generally realize the contradiction in that. Well, generally realize that the idea that the government had a right to, police people what they could and couldn't do means inherently that you couldn't really believe in a small government. Is that would inherently not be a small government?
Right, and that's another problem with minarchism because I kind of criticize both sides. Like a lot of people focus on
Yeah.
criticizing anarchism or minarchism. I criticize both. That's sort of my niche. But another
Hmm.
criticism of minarchism is okay, Mr.
Yeah, that
Minarchist,
wasn't
where do you
even
draw
like.
the line? Where do
Yeah.
I want small government, or I want a little bit of government. Okay, define small, define a little bit. Where do you draw the line
Hmm.
there? And another,
And after that, I would have, I guess, would have considered kind of went around between quote unquote libertarian and quotation marks and classical liberal for quite some time, until eventually decided to settle on actual libertarianism, and then went from minarchist to ANCAP. And it was actually Shane Killian's video on minarchism and ANCAP that
right?
caused me to take the to take the plunge into anarchism.
Yep, and I actually, because my view's a little bit unique. I sat on the fence for a while. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be an anarchist or a minarchist. So I guess I kind of
Hmm.
split, and
And during my actual minarchist phase, where I basically just believed in the night watchman state, I generally believed in that because I didn't think that anarchism could work. Not that I didn't think that it should have worked.
right, and I think generally
Hmm.
the idea is that the free market can kind of determine a lot. So that's why I kind of settled on panarchism as like my final viewpoint because it's like okay, I can't figure out for sure whether a society with a small government or no government will work better. So let's have them compete with each other. Let's have Anarchistan and Minarchistan next to each other, have them compete, and figure out which system is better. And then I kind of realized, well, you can do that with every other system, and that's kind of where panarchism came about. It's like this whole time I
Hmm.
was focusing on because it was kind of like an epiphany moment. This whole time I was focusing on which political system should there be for everybody, and I realized that's kind of a stupid way of thinking about it. That's kind of like asking what car should there be for everybody, or what flavor of ice cream should there be for everybody. If I can decide which hotel to stay at, which restaurant to eat at, why can't I decide which government to live under? So that's kind of like my epiphany there. Like this whole time I was thinking out the problem the wrong way.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where I was at. I was on the fence between the two, and it hit me. Why not have both and let people pick? So is there anything else you wanted to add?
Let's see here. There's not too much of one that I can really think. Um, I guess without getting into too specific and whatnot. Let me see here if there's anything else that comes to mind.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, I don't know if there really much of it is. Mm, yeah. Huh. Although I don't think there's anything else over there. Though I would like to some other time, possibly do
Oh
more
yeah,
podcasting with
I'll
you
just
and
have you
talk.
on again, and especially like I said, as if my channel gets big enough, chances are we'll do live streams with invite guests
Hmm.
on. Yeah, one can only hope because I know both of us are kind of in that same boat. We both just recently started on YouTube, so I was kind of sympathetic with you in the same boat there.
Hmm.
um, but yeah,
Yeah.
if there's nothing else you have to say, I guess we can close
Although I
this.
guess it's kind of funny is that nah, I'm not gonna mention that. Although I guess it's something that people could figure out about me pretty quickly. It's linked in my channel thing over there, so
Right, yeah. So, anyways,
it's
yeah,
not something I'm necessarily hiding. It's just something that's
right. So, anyways, if there's nothing further you have to add, I guess we can close it out here.
um yeah. I don't think there's anything really more for me to add at the moment.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming on, Mr. Libertarian Sith. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to
All right.
joining us
Yeah.
again. Everybody,
Okay.
thank you very much for watching. A link to Mr. Libertarian Sith's channel will be in the description. You can go check it out, watch his videos. Also, if any of you guys are interested in coming on my show for an interview, uh, my contact information will be in the description. Other than that, thank you very much for your time,
All right.
Mr. Sith, and
All right.
hope everyone enjoying their quarantine. Stay safe out there. Wear your masks, drink your fluids, whatever. And this has been Floss Possum making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.